Chapter 8. The vineyard was the first thing Noah planted. Not grain, not a garden to feed his family through the coming months. A vineyard, rows of cuttings pressed into the dark silt, staked and tied with the care he'd given every joint and plank of the ark. I watched him work the soil with his bare hands, kneeling in the mud the way God had knelt when he shaped Adam from the dust. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The valley below Ararat was good land. It was rich with the deposits the floodwaters had left behind, dark earth that yielded easily to the plow. God had blessed them before they came down from the mountain. Be fruitful and multiply. He'd told them, fill the earth. The same command he'd given Adam and Eve in the garden, as if starting the whole thing over. But there were new rules this time. God had given them permission to eat meat. That was different. In the garden, Adam and Eve had eaten only plants. Now the animals would fear humans, and humans would eat animals. The order of things had shifted. The world after the flood was harder than the world before it, and God adjusted the terms. He also told Noah about blood. The lifeblood of a creature was sacred, not to be consumed, and if any creature, animal, or human took the life of a human being, God would demand an accounting. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. God told Noah, for in the image of God has God made mankind. The image of God. There it was again, the thing I'd been turning over since Adam first opened his eyes. These creatures, fragile and mortal and made from dirt, still carried something that made their lives sacred. Even after the fall, even after Cain, even after the corruption that had drowned the world, the image remained. I filed that away. It felt important, though I couldn't say why. The months after the flood were quiet. Not the emptiness of the water-covered earth, but the productive quiet of people rebuilding. Shem and his wife worked the eastern portion of the valley, steady and methodical. They planted grain first, then orchards, then began laying the foundations for a permanent home. Shem prayed as he worked. Low murmured conversations with a God he couldn't see, offered between the swing of the axe and the placement of the stone. His father's habit carried forward. Japheth ranged wider than his brothers, exploring the territory beyond the valley, mapping the rivers and passes that would eventually become roads. He'd grown into himself during those months on the ark. The youngest son had stood silent while his father explained the impossible. Now he moved through the world with a quiet competence that reminded me of Noah in his building years. Ham was different. I'd noticed it on the ark, the restlessness, the sharp questions, the way he paced the lower decks when the waiting pressed too hard. I'd thought it was confinement. 8 people in a wooden box for over a year, with the sound of water on every side and no end in sight. Anyone would grow restless. But the restlessness didn't leave when the door opened. Ham worked as hard as his brothers. He built his shelter, cleared his land, helped his father with the vineyard. But there was a tightness around his eyes that didn't belong to a man starting fresh. He had a habit of looking at the horizon like he expected something to appear there. Something that would justify the waiting. The loss, the world that had drowned while he sat safe in a boat. He's angry, Hazel said. We were watching the settlement from the ridge above the valley. Hazel had been checking in more regularly since the flood, though I wasn't sure if it was concern for me or for the humans. Maybe both. Who wouldn't be, I said. He watched the world die. They all watched the world die, Hazel said. Shem isn't angry. Japheth isn't angry. People carry things differently, I said. Hazel looked at me. You're making excuses for him. Maybe I was. I'd done it before. Made excuses for Eve when she reached for the fruit. made excuses for Cain when his face fell at the rejected offering, found reasons to believe that the next choice would be different, that the pattern wouldn't hold. "I'm hoping," I said, though the word felt thin even to me. Hazel didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said what it always said. That hope, without evidence, was just another word for foolishness. The vineyard grew. That surprised me. I'd watched the plants come back after the flood, the slow greening of a world that had been scoured to bedrock. But Noah's vineyard grew with a vigor that seemed almost deliberate, as if the earth itself wanted to repay this man for everything it had taken from him. The vines thickened and the leaves spread. The fruit hung in clusters that darkened from green to deep purple over the course of a single season. Noah harvested the grapes himself. He crushed them in a stone basin he'd carved by hand. He collected the juice in clay vessels and let it sit in the cool shade of his shelter. I'd never seen wine before. No one had. It was a new thing in the world. This transformation of fruit into a liquid that altered the one who consumed it. I didn't know what it would do. Neither did Noah. The evening it happened, the air was warm and still. The kind of evening that reminded me of the garden, when God would come to walk with Adam in the cool of the day. Noah sat outside his shelter with a clay cup in his hand, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. His wife had gone to visit Shem's family. He was alone. He drank. At first it seemed fine. His shoulders loosened. The tension he'd carried since God first spoke to him about the flood seemed to lift. Years and years of it, finally easing. He leaned back against the wall of his shelter and looked up at the sky. And for a moment I saw something on his face I hadn't seen since the rainbow. Peace. He drank more. The peace shifted. His eyes went glassy. His movements became loose, imprecise. He stood up, stumbled, caught himself against the doorframe. He looked at the cup in his hand with an expression I couldn't read. The wine had taken his awareness along with the tension. His care, his caution. He went inside the shelter and didn't come back out. I stood at my post and felt a creeping unease. Nothing was wrong exactly. A man had drunk a new thing, and it had affected him in ways he didn't expect. That wasn't sin. That was ignorance. He'd discover what wine did and he'd be more careful next time. But the unease didn't leave. Ham found him. I don't know why Ham came to his father's shelter that evening. Maybe he needed something. Maybe he was looking for company. Some part of Ham was still the boy who sought his father's approval, even as the man resented needing it. He pulled back the flap of the shelter and stopped. Noah lay on his sleeping mat, uncovered. The wine had taken his awareness so completely that he'd removed his clothing without knowing or caring. He lay there exposed, vulnerable. The man who had walked with God and built the ark and led his family through the death of the world. Naked and unconscious on the floor of his tent. Ham stared at him. Ham's face made my stomach turn. No shock, no concern, no instinctive move to cover his father, to protect the man's dignity. His expression was colder than any of that. Satisfaction, maybe, or something closer to validation. The look of someone who has suspected a thing and finally found proof. His expression said it plainly, cold and satisfied. He's no better than the rest of us. Ham turned and left the shelter. He didn't close the flap behind him. He went straight to his brothers. I could hear him as he crossed the settlement, his voice carrying in the evening quiet. He wasn't whispering, he wasn't ashamed. He spoke with a casualness that made the words worse. Father's drunk. Ham told them. Lying naked in his tent, you should see it. The casualness of it. Like it was entertainment. Like the humiliation of the man who had carried God's covenant on his back for decades was gossip for a cooking fire. Shem's face went white. Japheth looked at Ham like he was seeing him for the first time. "What did you say?" Shem asked, his voice quiet and dangerous. Ham repeated it, added details, described what he'd seen with a precision that served no purpose except to deepen the shame. Shem turned away from him without a word. He found a garment, heavy and large, and held it between himself and Japheth. They walked backward toward their father's shelter, faces turned away, the cloth stretched between them like a curtain. They covered him without looking. I watched them do it, these two sons walking backward so they wouldn't see what their brother had eagerly described. The contrast cut deep. The same family, the same flood, the same God. And one son chose to expose while two chose to cover. "There it is," Hazel said beside me. I hadn't heard him arrive. He stood with his arms crossed, looking down at the settlement with an expression I knew too well. The expression that said, as it always did, that he had told me so. Even though, he said. God's own words. Every inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. He said it standing over Noah's altar. The smoke was still rising. "And now look. This isn't the same," I said, sharper than I'd intended. "No?" Hazel turned to me. Noah, the one righteous man, the one who walked with God lying drunk and naked in his tent. His son, who survived the flood by his father's faith, parading the shame for anyone who'll listen. How is this not the same? Noah didn't know what the wine would do, I said. "And Ham?" Hazel asked. "What's his excuse?" I didn't have one. "You said God promised never again," Hazel continued. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could feel the pressure behind it. "You said the rainbow meant he wasn't done with them? But look at them, Kemuel. Look at what they are. The flood didn't wash it out. The covenant didn't prevent it. The rainbow is barely visible from here, and already the rot is showing." "I know," I said quietly. "Then stop hoping," Hazel said, and the words came out like something he'd been holding back for centuries. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel. Because they were tired. Hazel wasn't attacking me. He was exhausted. We'd fought together for longer than this earth had existed. We'd lost friends. We'd watched the world drown, a family emerge, a promise hang in the sky. And we'd let ourselves believe, both of us, that maybe this time things would be different. And now Noah was lying naked on his floor, and his son was laughing about it. "I can't stop hoping," I said. Not because I had reasons, because the alternative was to become the kind of angel I didn't want to be. Hazel shook his head slowly. "That's not faith," he said. "That's stubbornness." "Maybe they're the same thing," I said. He walked away. No anger, no drama. Just turned and left, the kind of departure that says the conversation is over whether you agree or not. I watched him go and felt a distance open between us that hadn't been there before. Not a break. A strain. Two people who love each other seeing the same evidence and drawing different conclusions. Noah woke the next morning. I don't know if someone told Noah or if he simply knew. People know when they've been exposed in their vulnerability. Maybe the missing garment told its own story. Maybe the cloth his other sons had placed over him spoke of a correction that shouldn't have been necessary. He came out of his shelter, and his face was terrible. Different from the blankness on Cain's face after the murder. Different from Adam and Eve's shifting shame in the garden. This was a righteous man confronting his own foolishness and discovering that his failure had become his son's weapon. He called his sons. All three came. Shem and Japheth stood close together. Ham stood apart, and for the first time since the night before, I saw his expression shift. Uncertainty replacing satisfaction. The beginning of understanding that what he'd done might carry a weight he hadn't calculated. Noah looked at them. He looked at Ham for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that reminded me of God pronouncing the curses in the garden. Not because Noah was God, but because the words had that same quality of consequence, of things set in motion that couldn't be called back. "Cursed be Canaan," Noah said. Not Ham, Canaan. Ham's youngest son, who at that moment was playing in the dirt outside his parents' shelter, oblivious to what was being spoken over his future. "The lowest of servants will he be to his brothers," Noah said. I flinched, a curse that reached past the offender to his children. I'd seen this before. The ground cursed because of Adam. Death entering through one man's choice and spreading to every generation after. Sin didn't stay where it started. It moved forward, carried in blood and bone, and the pattern's parents pressed into their children. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," Noah continued. "May Canaan be the servant of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." Shem's line, blessed, Japheth's line, extended. Ham's line through Canaan, cursed. Ham's face darkened, but he said nothing. What could he say? His father had spoken, and the words had that finality I'd heard before from other lips. From God's lips. Words that described what would be because of what had been done. I thought about the seed. The promise God had made in the garden. The one I'd been turning over since the serpent's curse. The seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. If that promise was going to come through a human line, through a family, through a chain of blood and birth stretching all the way from Eve, then, which line? Which family? Shem's line, blessed by the God of Shem. I held on to that the way the dove had held on to the olive leaf. A small thing, but maybe enough. Noah lived for 350 years after the flood. I tell you that number, but I don't think you can feel it the way I felt it. 3.5 centuries of watching a man grow old, of watching his sons spread out across the valley, then beyond the valley, then beyond the mountains, of watching grandchildren become great-grandchildren, then names in a list so long I stopped trying to keep track. Noah planted, Noah built, Noah worshipped at his altar, bringing offerings the way Abel had. The way he always had. The wine incident wasn't the end of his story. It was a moment, a terrible moment, but not the whole. He never walked with God as Adam had. Those days were gone. But he talked to God every morning and every evening, the quiet conversation I'd listened to for decades. He taught his grandchildren about the flood, about the ark, about the rainbow and the promise. Some of them listened, most of them didn't. That was the part that wore on me. Not Noah's failure, Noah's faithfulness, the way he went on praying and teaching, even as the generations that followed drifted further from everything he'd survived for. He'd built a boat to save the world, and the world he saved was already forgetting why it needed saving. The nations grew. Japheth's descendants moved north and west toward coastlands and islands I'd never patrolled. Explorers and settlers filling distant territories. They were doing what God had commanded, spreading across the earth, even if they'd forgotten who gave the command. Shem's line stayed closer. Shem himself was a quiet man, devout, carrying his father's faith forward with the steady reliability he'd shown on the ark. His descendants built in the plains and river valleys. Not all of them prayed. Not always, but enough that I could trace a thread of faithfulness from Noah to Shem to the generations after. A thin thread. Sometimes so thin I thought it would break. But it held. Ham's descendants moved south and east. They built Nineveh and Babylon, cities that would become famous for reasons I couldn't yet see. They were ambitious and energetic, driven by that restless energy I'd watched in their father during the long months on the ark. They raised walls and towers and irrigation systems that showed the ingenuity I'd seen in Cain's line before the flood. And I saw the same trajectory. That unsettled me. Watching Ham's descendants build, I saw echoes of the world that had drowned. Not the violence, not yet, but the pride, the self-sufficiency, building as if the flood had never happened, as if the earth beneath their feet hadn't been scoured clean less than a generation ago. Sin hadn't drowned. God had said so, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. The words circled in my mind like the raven that had never returned to the ark. Restless, finding no place to settle. But I kept watching. Kept looking for the seed, because somewhere in these spreading nations, in these multiplying families, God was working toward an end I couldn't see. In this tangle of blessing, curse, and human choice, the promise he'd made in the garden hadn't been revoked. The seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. The line of Shem was blessed. And God, who had made a covenant with Noah and hung a rainbow in the sky, wasn't finished. I said as much to Hazel the last time I saw him before Noah died. We were on a hillside overlooking the plain of Shinar, where the largest concentration of humans had settled. Thousands of them now, spread across the landscape, all speaking one language, building with uniform bricks, sharing a restless ambition that made me uneasy. "Something's coming," Hazel said. He was looking at the plain, at the settlement that had grown larger than anything since before the flood. "They're gathering. They're supposed to gather," I said. "God told them to fill the earth." "He told them to fill it," Hazel said. "Not huddle in one place and stack bricks." He was right. They weren't spreading anymore. They were concentrating. Every new family that formed drifted toward this plain, drawn by a gravity that pulled like water downhill. And at the center of the gathering, a structure was taking shape. But that came later. Noah died on a morning when the sky was clear, and the vineyard he'd planted 3.5 centuries ago still bore fruit. His sons gathered, his grandchildren gathered. The whole settlement paused. Whatever else Noah had been, whatever that one night of wine and shame had revealed, he was the man God had chosen to carry the world through its remaking. I stood at a distance and watched them mourn. Shem wept openly. Japheth stood with his hand on his father's chest. Ham stood apart, as he always did, and I couldn't read his face. They buried Noah in the valley where the ark's timbers had long since been repurposed into homes and fences and firewood. The vessel that had carried everything through the flood was now scattered across the settlement, indistinguishable from ordinary lumber. That seemed right, somehow. The extraordinary becoming ordinary. The miracle dissolving into daily life until no one remembered it was a miracle at all. After the burial, I climbed back to the ridge and looked out over the plain of Shinar. The settlement was growing, the bricks were multiplying, and the people were looking upward, all speaking one language, all carrying that restless itch that had driven Cain to build the first city. Not at God, but at the sky, at the space between earth and heaven, at a gap they were beginning to think they could close on their own. I thought about Hadael, about Sariel, about the world that had drowned and the man who had just been buried, about the promise that still hung in the sky every time the clouds gathered, every time the rain fell and the light hit the water just right. I didn't understand any of it. The righteous failed. The wicked prospered. Sin survived the flood and grew in the hearts of the saved. And God kept going. He could have ended the whole experiment, started over with beings who wouldn't break his heart. But he kept going, kept loving them, kept promising. "I'm going to keep watching," I said to no one. Or maybe to God. The words left me before I'd decided to speak them. Because maybe one of them will be the answer, the seed, the thing you've been working toward since the garden. The wind moved over the plain, It didn't answer. But the rainbow was there, faint against the eastern horizon, barely visible unless you knew where to look.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.